Hi everyone, welcome back to LIS 570. So this week we're going to talk all about research design. In this lecture, what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview of how the design of research fits into our quarter, and then we'll talk in particular about some steps in the research design process. In particular, we're going to talk about external validity and internal validity. We're going to talk about units of analysis, and then we're going to talk for a kind of extended amount of time about the concept of sampling from both a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. All right, let's jump in. All right, so here's a schematic that might help us make a little bit of sense of kind of where we've been in the quarter so far and where we're going. So we started out, at least the first few weeks, of talking about epistemologies, ontologies, and the different ways in which our commitments to those two things aligned us with a certain paradigm of research. Okay, so in doing that, one of the things that we were reflecting on is what kinds of questions and what kinds of research problems or themes or areas are important to us. And we used that as a springboard to assignment 1, which helped us articulate in a very kind of rough cut what we thought were some interesting questions related to library and information science. Okay, now this week and the week following, we're going to be diving into literature reviews. We're going to be looking at, well, we've picked out a topic. What have other people studied and found about that particular topic? And in doing so, we're going to start to plan in a little bit more depth what it is we plan to ask and how we plan to answer that. So now when we come to a clear understanding and a commitment to answering a set of research questions, we're then going to enter a phase of designing our research. And that's what we're going to deal with this week. We're going to talk about units of analysis. We're going to talk about how we move to a sample of a population. And we're going to talk then about data management plans and instruments as we start to explore the way that we execute a research project. In the execution phase of a research project, that's when we're actually collecting and analyzing data. So the execution phase, we're going to investigate or sort of understand that through qualitative research and quantitative research in this particular class. We'll also talk about design research, but design research doesn't have kind of as clear little buckets of activities. The last section or the last part of our class then is going to be about publishing or making our findings accessible. That is how we begin to write up. So this week, right, we're finally moving away from planning and talking about all the conceptual foundations of the way that we do research and starting to jump in a little bit more practically about how we actually go about designing and executing our research. All right, so one of the steps or one of the reasons that we take steps to design research is because we are acknowledging that all of the things that we can ask have a certain bias and subjectivity behind them. And what we want to try to do is not completely eliminate bias, but we want to try to reduce the impact that our biases might have on the research questions that we ultimately want to answer. And so we kind of recognize that all research is going to be inherently biased. By being transparent, that is being clear and documenting the way in which we're going to presume to design a study and answer a set of research questions, we can remove some of the doubt or some of the skepticism of someone who may be reading our research. So we can think about the reduction of bias as coming through a kind of variety of techniques that we might take. One of them might be to make a protocol of all the different things that we're going to step through and that we're going to do in order to execute our projects. This is going to be the last assignment that we do. But one of the other techniques or one of the steps along the way in our designing of a research project is to deal with the concept of validity. And validity comes from two varieties. There's external validity and there's internal validity. So internal validity, what we mean is that we're going to rigorously design and we're going to adhere to some of the best practices of our field. Now, our field might be, for this class, for example, library and information science. And it might even be, for this class, maybe bibliometrics. So if we have a set of norms or a set of methods that we'll use in bibliometrics, then we're going to follow the best practices of using those norms and using the reporting that goes along with those norms. So for example, in a bibliometrics paper, I would often be required to formally state a hypothesis, test that hypothesis, and then give some empirical evidence of why I accepted or rejected my hypothesis. This would be an internally valid study if it included each of those components. Now, an externally valid study is that there's some representativeness or some generalizability of our findings. And we can try to achieve some form of external validity through the maybe statistical tests that we run if we're a bibliometrician. But maybe we think about this from a qualitative standpoint and we think, well, some external validity might be showing the transcripts of our interview with the person that we interviewed, showing the way that we inferred or made some meaning from the exchange we had in an interview and put that into a paper, right? So we're going to our subjects or we're going to our data and we're being rigorous about the ways in which we've jumped from an idea to a conclusion. And we're having some validity built into the external participants in our research study. In qualitative research, like I said, that's oftentimes going to a set of participants. In external validity for quantitative research, it often means having someone check over the statistics that we've run and using a set of statistics in which we make all of the underlying data available. So these two notions of validity, internal validity, which is the rigor of our design, and external validity, which is the checking with participants or subjects, are the ways in which we start to reduce the bias in our research at the design stage. Now, oftentimes in a research design phase, we're going to actually write down and document how it is we're going to handle internal validity or how it is we're going to handle external validity. So for the internal validity, we're going to write down some of the assumptions that we have. To go back to the example that I used before, if we're doing a bibliometric study, we're going to write down our hypotheses in advance of doing our research. If we're working on, say, a qualitative study, we're going to put down what are our research questions, and we're going to develop a research questionnaire or a set of questions we'll ask each interview subject. And we're going to make those explicitly available so that people can see. We're not just making things up in our findings. We have particular instruments and particular ways in which we're going about doing our research. So the documentation of our validity is kind of the first step or the first thing that we start to think about once we've come up with some research questions and we have a firm idea of what kinds of topics we're working on. All right, so one of the other ways that we're going to try to reduce bias in the research that we're doing is by sampling a population. And what we mean here by sampling in a really generic sense is that we're moving from a general population, say like the population of the United States, down to a sample which can be representative, which will allow us to generalize our findings without having to consult every single person that's a member of, or every single subject that's a member of the population. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but I kind of want to qualify sampling and the reduction of bias before we get started here. Because oftentimes I feel like we come to sampling as a set of techniques for reducing bias that sounds very deterministic or very positivistic. That is, we assume that there's one correct sample and that sample is representative of all of the populations that we could imagine. But it kind of depends on our goals here. So in qualitative analysis, for example, we may not be looking for generalization. We may just be interested in that particular sample. And so the techniques that we're going to talk about are just a way to gather a kind of manageable group of people. Similarly, in quantitative analysis, we may be looking to do kind of exploratory or suggestive work. We're not looking for an ultimate truth about the findings, and we're not claiming that, even if our statistics are valid, that these will hold up over time. We're looking for a first cut or a first idea. Now, that's not to say that there is some statistical analysis or quantitative analysis or some qualitative research that attempts to explore and actually discover known truths such that they would be unimpeachable. Now, this is kind of a different way in which we approach sampling, and we take the rigor of and the review of our sampling quite differently. So we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But the point that I want to make here is that sampling is really about the reduction of bias so that we can have healthy, trustworthy research findings. And we're doing this so that we can justify some of the beliefs that we have about what we actually ultimately find in our research, right? So let's tie this back real quick to the idea of epistemology. In epistemology, we said that knowledge comes from true justified beliefs, right? So we can think of sampling, and we can think of validity, and we can think of all the steps that we're going to talk about in our research design process as allowing us to justify why we believe something to be the case, why it is we are justified in the evidence that we have, and why those justifications in that evidence or that data supports the beliefs that we ultimately come to. Okay, so let's jump back then to thinking about sampling from a qualitative and a quantitative approach. So what we're doing, as I said in our kind of introduction to sampling, is looking for a population's representativeness. And we can think about this as kind of a framing of our subjects, such that in qualitative sampling, what we're looking for is a purposeful way to assemble that subsample or that subpopulation. So our participants, the cases that we might assemble, the ways that they will be chosen will be such that they align and they allow us to answer a set of research questions. We can often think about this as purposeful. That is, we're assembling a subpopulation or a sample because it serves the purpose of the research questions that we ultimately want to answer. Now, quantitative research is less about purposefulness and more about probability. So we have an ability to infer that a particular subpopulation or sample is going to give us representativeness of the broader population. So we can think about this in terms of a couple of examples, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. But I want to really put an exclamation point on the end of this difference between purposefulness and probability, because the two approaches to doing research, qualitative and quantitative, could really not be more different in their logic of sampling. Because as we talked about, many of the epistemologies that lend themselves to working from qualitative interpretive positions oftentimes assume and accept that there's going to be some biases. And so the designing of a, say, sample that can help us effectively answer our research questions is going to be somewhat based on the intent that we have of what we're going to do with our results. What kinds of generalizations or kinds of things do we hope to know or to justify for our beliefs? Now, quantitative research is really working from a position in which it's going to assume that we can reduce bias, and that if we do our sampling well enough and we run our statistics as rigorously as we can, then we have the ability to almost remove the bias. Now, this is going to assume that a sample is representative if it follows a logic that is probable, right? It's proportional to the number of people that exist within the population. This will become clear when we talk about how we do cluster sampling or how we do randomized sampling in just a couple of minutes. But I want to make sure that it's clear that the logic that sits behind how we sample is based on one, acknowledging bias, and the other is trying to remove some bias or trying to at least reduce its impact. All right, so let's start with qualitative sampling and discuss sort of how we go about arranging or the techniques that we can use to assemble a sample. So qualitative sampling has at kind of the heart of what it's trying to do an explicit recognition of two concepts that are important for how we go about sampling. So the first is the unit of analysis, and the second is the unit of observation. So the unit of analysis is really a focus on what it is we're going to study at kind of a mid-level. So I like to use this example of, imagine that we're going to go into a cafeteria in a high school and we're going to make some observations there about the way in which a set of cliques or a set of identities form around the way that people sit at tables. Right? So we can all imagine, or we can all think back to maybe our middle school or our high school or our grammar school in which we were allowed to first choose the table that we'd sit at. That was a pretty formative time in our socialization as adults, right? We were choosing and we were forming cliques with which we either felt some sort of like solidarity or some sort of identity. Okay, so in this imaginary study, our unit of analysis is going to be something like tables, right? It's going to be tables or people that form around a particular identity. Now, the unit of observation, that is what we actually observe, are not going to be the tables themselves, but the people sitting at the tables, right? So we can think about this as a more granular way in which we have a unit. Okay, so if we have our units of analysis and our units of observation identified before we start our study, the way that we might go about assembling and using that sample is going to depend somewhat on how we identify and how we choose people to be a part of our study. One of the things that we're going to try to guard really closely against is that we're not going to deviate in the way that we sample. So let's look at the next slide and think about sort of how we use techniques and how we stray away from, or we stay adherent to, not deviating from our sample. Okay, so in qualitative sampling, we typically have two approaches. We have purposeful sampling and a random sampling of our populations. So in random sampling, what we're going to do is we're going to use a technique which will allow us to have no bias or no choice in the way in which we assemble the people that will be a part of that sample. If we're going to work on purposeful sampling, it's going to be kind of the other end of the spectrum. That is, we are going to have a hand in the selection and in the assembly of our sample. So purposeful sampling is useful when we're looking for representativeness of a very small population. So for example, let's maybe think about the state librarians in the United States. There's only 50, right? And so we're probably going to be purposeful in who we're selecting in terms of wanting some diversity of gender, wanting some diversity of maybe educational background, etc. In a random sample, right, we would take another approach and we would say, well, I'm going to only pick maybe the person that comes up in the third list when listed third in a list when it's listed alphabetical, right? So we go through A to Z and just pick out maybe the 20 or so people that we could identify. All right, so random sampling is good when we want to try to have representativeness and we have very little understanding of, say, like what the sample should consist of. Now, we can think of cases where we're probably familiar with purposeful or random sampling. So purposeful sampling can be maybe based on theory, right? We can maybe have a theory about the way the world works, and we want to purposely assemble or construct a sample from that. Random sampling, right? We can think about maybe going from, say, what's called snowball or chaining. So maybe we interview one state librarian and then we say, do you know any other state librarians that it would be useful for us to talk to? And they would maybe suggest 2 to 3, and then we would go to those 2 or 3 state librarians, right? So the snowball or the effect is that we're asking one participant to suggest another participant, to suggest another participant, to suggest another participant. Now we can imagine that there's probably some bias, right? We're getting to use the language of our previous study of cafeterias, a little click going in that who knows whom is how we're assembling our particular sample there. So there's trade-offs and there's benefits and negative aspects of using a random sample like a snowball sample. One of the other ways we can think of sampling that is purposeful is when you have a critical case intervention. So for example, if we were looking at rural libraries that were affected by COVID, we would have critical cases in the sense that we would probably want to identify rural communities that were particularly impacted by, say, a COVID outbreak, and then go and find which are the intensity of the sample. So how much was one library affected versus another? Is it still closed? Is it open for maybe delivery? These are the kinds of things that we would think about when we were assembling a case that seemed critical to trying to answer a particular set of research. All right, so let's now start to think about quantitative sampling. Just like in a qualitative tradition, we assume that there's some bias which gets introduced by the subjectivity and the imperfection of us as researchers. This doesn't preclude us from trying to ferret out or trying to remove some of that bias as we assemble a subset of a population that we want to study. Now, what's crucial to understand about quantitative approaches to sampling is that we're assembling a representative group. That is, the subset of the population, the sample that we have, is going to be assembled for the purpose of their ability to allow us to infer about the general population. So what we want to be able to do then from a quantitative standpoint is have people that are, or subjects that are going to allow us to meaningfully, in a way that will be justified through our statistics, a way to talk about a general population from a subset. Now, we have examples kind of from our everyday lives where we think about this and we interpret and we interact with samples from a quantitative standpoint all the time. So polling, for example, the American Community Survey, even the gross domestic product of the USA, is all based on the idea that we quantitatively sample subsets of the population and we come up with general numbers in which we kind of make our estimated or best guess. And we know that polling remains an open-ended question for political science. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. There's lots of different techniques in which we can try to get at some representativeness and get at some authenticity of the way that we move from a population to a subsample. But just because it's random, systematic, and it has an important kind of theory sitting behind it, doesn't mean that it can't be wrong. And so I want to offer that as kind of a caveat as we move forward, is that the kind of techniques that we'll talk about, which are random, systematic, and clustering for assembling a sample in quantitative research, all have their downfalls, just like the biases that are going to be introduced in doing qualitative research. All right, so let's jump in and let's look first at how we randomly sample from a quantitative approach. All right, so in its most simplest form, random sampling simply means that we're going to select a population subset such that any member of the population is equally likely to arrive at or to be a part of the sample. So we can think about this as maybe, the simple techniques that we remember using as a kid. So drawing numbers from a hat, maybe drawing straws. We can also think about this being a kind of sophisticated way in which we use an algorithm, which is going to ensure that every maybe, say, second or fifth person is going to be selected. In advance, what is required for doing a simple random sampling, though, is that we have to know the size of our population. That is, if we want to assemble a random sample, right, we have to know what exactly it is we're sampling. So it's important to sort of note, as the simple graphic has here, we can assemble our sample from, say, maybe 3 rows, and we'll pick a random person in each row to put into our sample of 4. If what we want to do is reduce our sample from a population of 12 to a sample of 4. All right, so now let's talk about, or let's look at another way in which we can randomly sample a population, but do so with a little bit more purpose. So one of the ways in which we oftentimes need to sample a population is by dividing the population up into things that we know about or things that we want to know about that population. So let's use the example for the 12 member population that we have here, that the colors represent something about college education. So if we're doing a poll about potential voters and their college education, then we want to arrange our population, not just by how many people exist in it, but by what their representativeness of a, say, college education is. So let's say our blues are college educated. Let's say our reds are not college educated. And let's say our greens are unknowns. This has, I just realized, no political implications of blue and red. I don't mean anything by that. Okay, so let's assume then that we want to sample from that population. So now what we have arranged are strata. So 1, 10, and 12 are a strata, 2 through 11 are a strata, and 3, 5, and 9 are another strata. We want to sample from those equally, such that when we assemble a sample, it's proportional to the population. So if we have 3 and 6, or 3, 6, and 3 as a number of each strata, we're going to sample 1 person from the first strata, 2 from the second strata, and 1 from the third strata. And what we have then is a reduction of our population of 12 to 4. But now we have that in such a way that we've guaranteed that the sample includes people that are college educated, people that are not college educated, and people that are unknown in proportion to what we know about the population. Pretty neat, right? So one of the other really neat things is that we can also combine the way in which we random and stratify our samples. So if we take these two together, one of the things that we can do is randomly select from each strata to assemble our sample. So in the example on the left, we have our random sampling, and an example on the right, we have our stratified sampling. Now imagine we just randomly sample using the same approach once we've subdivided the population into strata. So from 1 to 12, 1, 10, and 12, our algorithm would go and pick out, say, a random person to include in our sample. For 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 11, it's similarly going to pick out 2 more people from that to be a part of our population. So random and stratified sampling are 2 of this kind of most basic ways we approach quantitative sampling and the assembly of something like a population sample or a population subset, which can be representative for our purposes. All right, so I talked about in the random sampling example, the way in which we might offload some of the way that we actually pick out people based on not the technique, but based on whether it's like drawing numbers from a hat or using a computer algorithm. So let's talk, or let's put some language to what that looks like. So one of the ways in which we can do sampling, which has a way to select the member of the sample, is called systematic. And we use systematic sampling when we don't really know much about our population of study. That is, we don't have the idea, or we don't know that we can divide it into strata, and we don't know necessarily how big it is. So one of the things that we might do then is start to, say, create a rule in which we'll systematically and in the systematic way try to reduce the bias or the size of our, reduce the bias of our sample as it's representative of a population. So we can think about this as the example that I used earlier of every third person or every second person. In doing so, we would select every second person until we get to the end of our population, and then that represents what we think of as a sample. Now, this is probably the easiest way, or the most simple way in which we sample, and it can lead to, or it can generate a certain amount of bias that doesn't seem very satisfying to us as researchers. Okay, so on one hand, we have the systematic sampling, which happens when we don't know a whole lot about the way that our population is arranged, and we may have difficulty picking out and arranging it as strata. So another way we can approach sampling is when our data our subjects are already organized into maybe meaningful groups. So this is called cluster sampling, and we can use the example that we talked about before of doing a study of cliques in a maybe high school cafeteria. So our population may already be divided into particular tables. Those tables we can think of as a cluster of people that we want to sample from our population. So to effectively sample that population, we're going to try to respect somewhat the clusters that already exist. Because if we just looked at, for example, a roster of everyone that goes to a high school, and we picked off the third person in the list in a systematic way, what we might come up with is a bunch of people that all sit at the same table. And that wouldn't tell us much about cliques, right? It would tell us a lot about that particular table. So if we come across, say, an example in which we have people sorted already by their own choosing, one of the ways that we might try to assemble our data then is by that clustering or by that choosing. And so what we want to do then is take some approach in which we can assemble members of a sample that are representative of those clusters. So what we can do then is first treat the clusters as a sample. So we can maybe select every third cluster to sample from, and then select how we maybe assemble or put people into that cluster for our sample. So instead of selecting, say, an individual at a table, maybe we select every third table. And by selecting every third table, we come up with a sample of 2 or a sample of 9, and that gives us a way in which we can understand not every clique at the cafeteria, but maybe 9 cliques that exist in the cafeteria. So what this allows us to do, that is cluster sampling, is it allows us to respect the sort of formation of clusters and to generalize from the clusters as opposed to the individuals. Now, think about when or some areas in which this might be really helpful. So at the census level, right, that is when we do a count of everyone that exists in the United States, and we ask a bunch of questions about their income, about how many people live at their home, etc. We probably don't want to do analysis on individual levels. We might want to do analysis that aggregates to kind of a higher level, like a city block or a maybe household level. So census studies give us the ability to have clusters in which we might select, if we were doing maybe a census-based study of the city of Seattle, randomly select different blocks in which we would study. That would be an example of random and cluster sampling together. We can also think of classrooms in a maybe university. So if we think about student evaluations of teachers, then we probably don't want to infer statistics about each individual person and how they judge their teachers. We probably want to infer about a class and the way that they judge the teacher. So we may look at, for example, all of the classes that I've taught and select clusters, meaning classes, to understand if I'm an effective teacher or not. So we've had random, stratified, and cluster sampling. Now, let's just try to sum up real quick so we kind of make sure that we're all on the same page here. So the differences in these methods of sampling really are about how a population is arranged and then how we select individuals from that population. What we're trying to do from each of these is say that the likelihood of the sample is based on a particular approach in which we've assembled that sample. That is, the likelihood that it's representative of a particular population. And we're trying to generalize in some way, but we may have maybe guards or we may have apprehension about how well those generalizations can move from the sample to the population level. One last parting shot that I think is really important is oftentimes we have the ability to combine, say, cluster sampling and random sampling. And we have the ability to combine, say, a stratified sample and a random sample. But one of the other ways that social science researchers in particular assemble samples is through what they might call multi-stage sampling. So we might take a kind of systematic approach first. We might look for maybe the third person in a population, just randomly selected every third person. And when we have that sample, we then look for their membership as a part of clusters and take just the clusters from that sample population. We can think about using this technique when we have a really, really big population, and what we want to do is get to something manageable in a short amount of time. That way we can combine, say, a systematic with a cluster sampling. This is also quite common when we work on economic or actually bibliometric studies. So it's worth understanding or knowing kind of that these multi-stage sampling can exist, just takes kind of diligence and design first, and then a diligence and a design second to execute both of those accurately. All right, so to sum up, we've talked about research design this week, and we've talked about two of, I think, kind of the most exciting and the most interesting aspects of designing our research. That is how we start to tie the epistemological and ontological assumptions we have to the ways in which we're going to start to operationalize, that is, put into terms in which we can actually study a particular topic. And we did this through talking about internal and external validity, the way that we document that and are clear about the maybe biases that may creep into our research. We also talked about observation units, that is a unit of observation and a unit of analysis, and how we differentiate those to make sure that we're actually studying the thing that we assume to be studying. Now, we then moved to talking about assembling a sample of a population. And this is all about trying to have some representativeness of what we're studying and not having to study everything that's related to it. We do this so that we can generalize, but we also do this so that we can justify some of the beliefs that we have in understanding or knowing or coming to some conclusions from our study. So the kind of thing that I want to leave you with is to pay attention to the way that study designs and sampling in particular makes its way into your daily lives. When someone tells you that 54% of, say, people college educated in the US, pay attention to actually what the denominator is. So how many people were a part of that study? It'll turn you into a skeptic, and it'll start to really sour you probably on a lot of things that you read. But as being kind of diligent and being careful about the way that we design our own research, one of the things that we want to try to do is be as transparent as possible. Be as clear as we can be sure that we know these things based only on how much evidence we have from a particular sample. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the presentation or the publication of our results. But I always like to put this out there because I think it's one of the things that even when I start teaching this class, I start to really dial in and start to focus more on in everyday examples from my life. So if you come across a particularly egregious example, please post it to Canvas or share it. I think it's always fun when we look at these together. If you have any questions on research design, please get in touch and we'll talk then. All right.